This day is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. You chose to hit play on this podcast today. Smart choice. Make another smart choice with Auto Quote Explorer to compare rates from multiple car insurance companies all at once. Try it at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and affiliates, not available in all states or situations. Prices vary based on how you buy. Hello and welcome to This Day, a history show from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. And this is part 2 of our episode on William Freeman with Robin Bernstein of Harvard. So to bring us up to speed, it is 1846 in upstate New York. William Freeman suffered abuse in his time in the for-profit Auburn prison. And now it's a few months after being released, and he has committed a gruesome, random murder, an act of terrorism, as Robin put it, in part to try and raise awareness about the slave labor conditions inside the prison. He's now been arrested and the trial is beginning, and as you'll hear, the trial is a sensation, and it brings up all sorts of larger questions about not just the prison, but the effectiveness of Freeman's shocking act and the larger anti-slavery movement. We'll pick this story up with William Henry Seward entering the picture. Now, you may know that name because he would soon be Secretary of State, but in 1846, he is a prominent lawyer in upstate New York, and he picks up the case defending Freeman. So, anyway, here are me and Nicole Hammer of Vanderbilt and Kelly Carter-Jackson of Wellesley talking to Robin Bernstein. This starts with Nikki's question about the trial.
So ultimately, William Freeman is arrested and he's put on trial. And this is fascinating to me that William Henry Seward shows back up at this moment, doesn't intervene in that earlier period, but in this moment, he steps up to defend William Freeman. How does that happen?
Well, it happens through a whole lot of mechanisms by white people. It involves Seward, it involves his wife, it involves a local minister named John Austin. Basically, all of these people come together to decide that Seward should defend Freeman pro bono. Now, what's really important here is that Seward did not defend Freeman because Seward actually respected the claim that Freeman was making. It was quite the opposite. Seward was economically entangled with the Auburn State Prison, and he was in fact politically entangled with the Auburn State Prison. By this time in history, the prison had become a kind of political seesaw whereby political parties were fighting through the prison. And Seward was a Whig, and he had become governor twice, largely in part by manipulating the prison itself and manipulating scandals that were happening in the prison. He was able to use them politically. So he was, and I show in the book how he was totally entangled politically, he was entangled economically, but this didn't make him unusual. This made him normal. This is how the prison functioned. This is how the prison manufactured consent, by entangling everybody in one way or another. So Freeman has made the prison shake. Freeman has called the entire system into question. Freeman has freaked out the entire region, mainly, but not only white people. And so Seward steps up, not to amplify his challenge, but to muffle it. And the way he muffles the challenge is by defending Freeman by using the insanity defense. So his claim in court is that Freeman is 100% irrational, and that he committed this act out of pure insanity and literally nothing else. And then he had an argument about why Freeman was insane. But this was a really good way to shut William Freeman up and to silence his very rational critique of the Auburn State Prison.
So, I mean, to state the obvious, their insanity is part of the picture here, or mental deterioration is part of the picture here, to be clear. As we've discussed, I think you're pointing out that Seward's argument was this was a all or nothing, 100%, this was the only motivation, is the way he sort of tried to use this to muffle the larger idea. But did anyone start to connect the dots then? If the argument is he's 100% insane, did anyone connect the dots and say, well, what made him 100% insane? Was it the conditions inside the prison?
Yes. Okay. So yes, absolutely. That was the next question. If he was insane, why was he insane? And Seward had two answers to that question. One was that he was insane because of his beating in the Auburn State Prison. There was one beating in particular that was so terrible. A guard beat him over the head with a board and beat him so terribly that the board actually broke on his head. And he had a skull injury, he had a brain injury, and as a result of this, he became deaf. And so there's no question that William Freeman had a mental impairment. And I, in no way do I deny that. The point that I make is that it's perfectly possible for a person to have a mental impairment and to make a rational political claim. Right. There's no contradiction there. So Freeman absolutely was mentally impaired. There's no question. So Seward argues in court that Freeman is 100% irrational because of A, the beating on the head, but also, and here's where like my mind gets blown. Also, he claims that Freeman has been made irrational, has been driven insane by racism, by racial discrimination.
Interesting.
And he makes the argument, yes, I know. Makes the argument.
It's wild. I know. You just blew my mind a little.
I know. It blows my mind. He makes the argument in court. And I want to say really clearly that this court case got so big, so fast. It was reported nationally. So Seward's arguments were exported. They were disseminated nationally. A pamphlet is made up with Seward's argument, and thousands of copies of this pamphlet are distributed. So these ideas, which at the time were relatively new, these ideas went very far, very fast. Now, let's note that William Freeman never claimed racism as a cause of his actions. He was crystal clear. This was about the prison. This was about his rights as a citizen, his right not to be enslaved. This was about his right to be paid for his work. He never said it was about the fact that he was excluded from school, for example, which is what Seward argued. So this is an argument that, of course, 150 years later or 120 years later, would become part of the Moynihan Report. This idea that racism, and Seward was absolutely explicit about this, and he specifically blamed Black women, by the way. So the argument, I know, it's mind-blowing. This is all in the book. So Seward argues that there's racism, which then causes Black communities to have basically a tangle of pathology, to quote the Moynihan Report 120 years later, that he claims, and he specifically goes after the Black women in William Freeman's life. And this is heartbreaking. He specifically goes after William Freeman's mother, puts her on the stand, and then roasts her. And he specifically goes after William Freeman's best friend and his sister-in-law. And so this, of course, these kinds of...
And nothing to do with the state, nothing to do with capitalism, nothing to do with everyone's investment in this prison. I mean, nothing to do with the torture that's happening in the prison.
No.
Wow.
This is Seward's argument, and this is how Seward shuts up William Freeman. And what really blows my mind is that what Seward did was he articulated an emerging form of racism, one that at the time was not deeply embedded in the culture. This was, certainly Seward did not invent this argument. Certainly he was not the very first one to make this kind of Moynihan argument, but he was among the first. And what was really special about this trial was because it was so high profile and because it was disseminated so far and wide, this relatively new emerging form of racism metastasized
Yeah.
And this is one of the origins, but it's a really important origin point for this particular kind of racist argument.
So, I mean, this is all very fascinating to me, and we want people to read the book. So we don't want to give away the whole story. We do know that Freeman is convicted of this murder. But can you tell us sort of about the social or cultural or even political aftermath?
Yeah.
Like, what does the nation make of this case?
Yeah.
And this prison, really, because the prison continues to exist and is still in existence to this very day.
Yeah. Yeah. So the prison exists to this day, and I'd love to talk to you about that more. The Auburn system of prison for profit, of course, travels across New York State. It travels across the Northeast, down to the South, to the West. And basically, it becomes the norm today. So the idea that a prison can, and some would argue should, be an economic force, that is common sense to us today. So one of the effects of the Auburn prison and the people in my book is that if that is just seems to be a very commonplace, ordinary idea to us, if that idea is already in our heads, that idea was planted in us by the people in my book. So the specific effects of the trial, well, there were a lot of specific effects. I mean, one of the big effects was the dissemination of this particular emerging form of racism. And again, that is implanted in all of us today. I didn't even talk about the prosecution. So the prosecution made an argument because they were also invested in shutting up William Freeman's charge against the prison. The prosecution was also invested in the prison and entangled in it. And the way they shut him up was by making the argument that he had committed this act of violence because of inherent, essential biological race. Basically, it was the basic argument of the criminalization of Black people, which again now is everywhere, but at the time was relatively new. So the effects of this are that these two emerging forms of racism get amplified and disseminated everywhere. When I was writing this book, my mind got blown so many times. And we're talking about a lot of the mind-blowing moments.
I know.
but there are so many more. So here we have this giant event where a Black young man, by this time he's 22, a young Black man has something really important to say and gets really shut down and shut up. And what happens after the trial? Black abolitionists start coming to Auburn. They start coming to Auburn, and they had never come before. People like Frederick Douglass start coming to Auburn. And did they talk about William Freeman? No, they do not. Instead, what they do is they talk about their own stories. They tell their own stories. They narrate their own lives. The exact right that was taken away from Freeman to tell his own story, to present his own political beliefs, that is what is exercised by people like Frederick Douglass. And Auburn becomes a center for abolitionist publishing. It becomes a major stop on the Underground Railroad. So in the wake of Freeman's disastrous trial, a new kind of freedom talk flourished in the shadow of this new form of unfreedom, the prison for profit.
I'm David Remnick, host of the New Yorker Radio Hour. There's nothing like finding a story you can really sink into that lets you tune out the noise and focus on what matters. In print or here on the podcast, The New Yorker brings you thoughtfulness and depth and even humor that you can't find anywhere else. So please join me every week for the New Yorker Radio Hour, wherever you listen to podcasts.
This episode is brought to you by Mint Mobile. Let's take a moment to talk about your wireless bill. Maybe you, like me, take a look at that bill every month and get a little shudder that goes down your spine, and you ask yourself, how can it cost so much to get wireless service? But guess what? It really doesn't have to be that way. You can say bye-bye to your overpriced wireless plan's jaw-dropping monthly bills and unexpected overages because Mint Mobile is here to rescue you with premium wireless plans that start at $15 a month. All of their plans come with high-speed data, unlimited talk and text delivered on the nation's largest 5G network. You can use your own phone, you can transfer over. I made the switch from one of the major carriers recently. It was incredibly seamless. And just like that, it was like, I really didn't have to be paying that much all these years. If you like your money, Mint Mobile is here for you. Shop plans at mintmobile.com/thisday. That's mintmobile.com/thisday. Upfront payments of $45 for 3-month 5GB plan required, equivalent to $15 a month. New customer offer for first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See Mint Mobile for details. This episode is brought to you by Quince. Folks, it is officially time to start thinking about refreshing your wardrobe for the spring. Maybe even leveling up with a little affordable luxury. Well, Quince is here to help. Quince offers a range of high-quality items at prices within reach. I'll tell you the section of Quince that I'm most excited about, which might tell you something about where my head's at. There's a section on the site called The Vacation Shop. I just ordered a new pair of sunglasses from there. They have an Italian leather sling for under $100, hats, cases, even luggage if you want. I have made a vow to travel in linen and only linen, so I've stocked up on a couple European utility shirts, $45. That's it. And a new pair of nice-looking board shorts, $40. So I am all set for my summer travels. If you've got your eye on all the fun that comes with warm weather, go ahead and give Quince a shot. Go to quince.com/thisday for free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. That's QUINCE.com/thisday to get free shipping, 365-day returns. Quince.com/thisday.
I'm so glad that you took us to that moment because I think often when we talk about this particular kind of institutionalized violence and institutionalized racism, it doesn't have a happy ending.
Yeah.
And this obviously is going to immiserate a lot of people going into the 20th and 21st centuries. But the ability of people to take a space of a crime like this, the crime against William Freeman, and to turn it into something else, to give it meaning, to sort of reconsecrate the town with their activism strikes me as a particularly hopeful note in a dark story.
Yeah.
Well, this is, it's mind-blowing to me because, I studied the abolitionists. I'm like, Auburn, isn't that a great place to be for Black people? Aren't a lot of Black abolitionists circulating in this town? A lot of, upstate New York places. You think about Syracuse, think about Buffalo, you think about these places where they are safe havens for Black abolitionists and for fugitive slaves. And so having this counter narrative of the prison there, having the story of the prison really gives you a much fuller picture of what Black people are combating and what they're up against, that it's not just the institution of slavery, that it's all of it's capitalism and all of its other cronies that are doing the work of dehumanization.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And it also, by putting Auburn's prison in the center of Auburn, which this prison is in the center of Auburn. It's in the center geographically. It's in the center of its economy. It's in the center of its history. By simply acknowledging that, one thing that we do is we reveal some really important silences. So Harriet Tubman lived in Auburn for over 50 years, and she seems never to have spoken in public about the prison. And Harriet Tubman was a genius. And she lived 2 miles from the prison. And she bought her land from, guess who? William Henry Seward and his wife.
Oh, she sure does.
Yeah.
She sure does.
And she worshiped at the AME Zion Church, which was where many, many members of William Freeman's family worshiped. So she knew his family, and yet she never once said a word in public. We can assume she had lots to say about it in private. But by noticing that silence, we can think about it critically. Like, what does that silence mean exactly? Well, I don't know, but we can certainly think about it, and we can imagine possibilities of what that silence might mean. What we know for sure is that that silence means something, that it's significant.
Final question, and I want to ask the three of you as historians a little bit about the kind of work of historical complexity. First off, I should say, I'm sure listeners maybe are thinking this, and I want to say I'm thinking this, I think of Luigi Mangione as you described this story a little bit. And especially, the conversation we were having about the difference between an act of revenge and an act of terrorism. And, I think Mangione probably fits in somewhere along the spectrum between personal vendetta and pure act of sort of removed random violence. But the reason I bring that up is in part because I think some of the discourse around what do we make of that act was the separation between the sort of act itself and the idea behind the act. And that feels like a really important thing to think through when we think of William Freeman's behavior. He murdered these people, and then there was an idea behind that murder, and we can kind of live in that complexity and that uncertainty and so forth. So I'm just wondering, Robin, and all of you, like, how do you do the work of history and hold all those complicated things in your head at the same time and have empathy and complexity and all these things we've been kind of swirling around?
Well, one thing I want to say is that, Kelly, your scholarship was so helpful for me in understanding the act of violence, because as I was writing this book, one of the key questions that I was struggling with was, what does it mean that Freeman changed from trying to pursue legal means to committing an act of violence, committing a quadruple murder? And one thing I learned from your scholarship is that conversations about violence as a viable political tool were in the air at this moment. And they were specifically in the air among Black people in New York State. And to understand that kind of context, to help me understand the violence as political and as less extraordinary than it otherwise might seem. It was less of a leap than it might otherwise seem. So your work really helped me to bridge this key moment and this very big question, and to do it with empathy. And to take it really seriously, not just to say, well, he was on the side of the angels and then he left. It's so much more than that. And your scholarship helped me see that. And so I thank you for it.
Thank you.
I want to jump in too, because just last week in my graduate seminar, I taught a book called Force and Freedom by Dr. Kelly Carter Jackson.
That's right.
And one of the things that we really lingered on, in addition to just the real flipping of this notion that political violence is always bad and we must always just condemn it and not understand it. And that I think is the historian's first push, is to go past condemnation into something deeper and more nuanced. But we carry these binaries and these very Manichaean ways of thinking about morality with us. If you're raised in the United States, if you're raised in white households, if you're raised in Christian households, you have very clear, black and white views, I think, of some issues that we inherit from history, that we inherit from our culture. And violence and nonviolence is one of those. And what is so rich and useful about your work, Kelly, is that you invite us to set that down and start asking questions. And all really excellent history does that. It says, okay, I see the things that you're bringing to this, and now I'm asking you to take a beat and think about it differently. So I just wanted to add on to the commendations.
All right, I got to steer this back from praising Kelly to praising Robin.
Feel all mushy. Wrap up. Let's wrap up.
Yeah, but I really wanted to end on that note, because I think that's the point of what I've learned over the course of doing the show. That's the point of what brilliant scholars like you do, is you tell great stories from the past, but obviously we then carry those into this very complex, violent, complicated moment, and it really does help us navigate. So Robin, thank you so much for doing this. It was really, really just a thrilling tale and also really brilliant kind of scholarship. So thank you and congratulations. The book, of course, is Freeman's Challenge. Listeners, there's a lot more in there. But Robin Bernstein, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. This was an absolute pleasure and an honor. I'm so glad to be here. Thank you so much.
Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kelly Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Radiotopia.